which is around the relationship between climate action and democracy, and essentially asking the question, starting from the observation that I think was implicit in Samantha's opening remarks, and also in the ambassador's opening remarks, about the challenges inherent in, particularly in democratic decision-making institutions, in terms of responding to climate change. So I want to offer some insights in terms of whether we need less democracy or more democracy in our national policymaking institutions. I should clarify that that'll be the focus of my remarks on the national level rather than on the international level, which Ambassador Francis talked about in his opening remarks. And I would very much echo his sentiments around the need to work together, including in the run-up to COP26 that's just around the corner. So to start off with this question of emergency politics, I won't go into any detail about climate science or the details of the nature of the challenge, but just to say, so this is one figure from the United Nations Emissions Gap Report. So this is an annual report from the United Nations Environment Programme that basically shows the gap between where we are and where we're headed, and what we need to do in order to remain consistent with the temperature goals enshrined in the Paris Agreement. And there's quite a lot going on in this figure. It's quite a complicated picture, but really the thing to focus on is the profound change in direction. So we have these kind of business as usual lines going roughly in an upward direction out to 2030. But if we want to stay below even 2 degrees, the higher of the 2 temperature goals in the Paris Agreement, there's a really quite profound change in direction needed. And that change is all the more pronounced if we look at the line for 1.5, remaining under the 1.5 temperature goal. So a radical transformation is what this picture is telling us we need to aim for. And that has, I think, understandably led campaigners, people in the environmental movement, activists, to describe this as an emergency situation. And so we've had various campaign groups, Extinction Rebellion in this part of the world, in the UK and in Ireland and elsewhere, calling on governments to declare climate emergencies. That, again, coming back to the ambassador's remark, that fiercely urgent challenge of now, the need to do something really radical right now. We've been kicking the can down the road for many years now, and the time for rhetoric has stopped. The time for action has started. And so this call for a declaration of climate emergencies led governments around the world at various levels of government, national governments, subnational governments, local, city, town level, to declare climate emergencies. I've taken this map from a website that tries to track the declarations of climate emergencies, and you can see there are lots of them in lots of parts of the world. There are there are significant gaps also across the African continent and Asia. I'm not sure, is that a limitation of the data, or is that a real distribution? But nonetheless, there have been, I think what this map shows us is that there have been declarations of climate emergencies in many parts of the world. But in a way, that's the easy part. The declaring a climate emergency is the easy part. And the question, the really important question is what flows from that? What are the consequences of declaring a climate emergency? And I think it's fair to say that in many jurisdictions, the troubling observation is that actually not that much has followed from the perspective of climate action. And so I want to explore and try and tease out what an emergency response would look like. And also to express some concerns, so notwithstanding the scale of the transition needed, to set out some concerns about emergency politics. And in this respect, I'm drawing on the work of Mike Hume, who is a prominent climate scientist based in the UK. And he poses a number of questions in a paper published a year or two ago in response to this wave of declarations of climate emergencies. And he pointed out a number of challenges around the idea of the politics of climate emergencies. So he notes that emergencies promise the mass mobilization of resources, in terms of economic, social, technical resources to ward off an existential threat, and we might well agree that that is warranted in the case of climate change, our response to climate change. But there are also, I think, some troubling aspects of this from a civil rights perspective. So emergencies can threaten constitutional rights, justify the suspension of normal politics, restrict freedoms, and those are limitations on which I think it's important to have open societal debates about the balance between liberty and civil rights and climate action. And another point that Mike Hume makes is around the singular focus on climate change and why climate change alone should be placed at the center of policy making. And the risk here is really that it crowds out other very important policy challenges. He mentions, for example, antimicrobial resistance, the eradication of poverty, and the challenge is to try to, I guess, incorporate climate change into as a priority in policymaking without leading to the neglect of lots of other policy priorities that we also hold dear. And the third element of Hume's critique is that it's a quasi-permanent state. So if you declare an emergency, it's hard to undeclare an emergency. And indeed, in the case of climate change, we know that the response is going to have to be over the course of not just months or years, but decades. So if we are suspending civil rights, we are arguably, or according to Hume, you're potentially doing so on a quasi-permanent basis. And so if we think about the different dimensions of emergency governance, I've tried to identify, to divide it into 5 different categories around policy prioritization, resources, the role of technocrats and experts, parliamentary oversight, and the role of stakeholder and civil society input. And arguably, emergency governance calls for the elevation of the issue of concern, in this case climate change, above all other concerns. In terms of mobilization of resources, it calls for emergency allocation of finance and other resources to tackle, in this case, climate change, but that then raises questions around whether funding is being removed from other important social goals. In terms of delegation to technocrats or experts, emergency politics often calls for the insulation of decision-making from democratic decision-making. So basically giving important governing functions to non-elected technocrats. By extension and related, reducing the role of accountability and oversight, both parliamentary accountability and also the potential for stakeholder and civil society input. So I think we can have a reasonable debate over each of these elements, and we might collectively agree that some or all of these are worth pursuing. But I think it's important that we acknowledge the consequences of emergency politics if we are to go down the road of declaring climate emergencies and then following through on them. And my own perspective would be that some of these are quite troubling, and that particularly the erosion of democratic accountability in decision making is something that normatively I find somewhat troubling in some of these debates. But there are perhaps less invasive or less extreme versions of these arguments around democratic reform. And I want to point to two types of examples in the remaining time I have. One is an argument for less democracy, so that builds on some of the themes that I was talking about. And the other is an argument in favor of greater democracy through the use of deliberative democracy. So to start off with the idea that we might need less democracy. So as I said, this is a continuation of the strand in my in my earlier remarks, but it's perhaps a more modified version. And it's basically an attempt to deal with what economists call the time inconsistency problem, which is basically the fact that governments have an incentive to renege on their previous commitments. And so one way to address this is to lock in policy commitments to give credibility to policy stability. And one prominent example of this in a different policy area is the delegation of monetary policy to independent central banks. And there are a variety of other examples across different policy areas where functions of public policy are delegated to independent experts. And so we see a version of this in climate policy. And in the academic literature, this argument goes back to an article in the early 2000s by Dieter Helm and colleagues, who in a UK context made a proposal for an independent energy agency. And they outlined three possible functions for what this energy agency could do. One was that it would have a duty to meet the target, and the target here was a carbon reduction target by any means it deemed suitable. A second was that the energy agency would have a duty to meet the target by using a particular policy instrument, so it's a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme. And the third was a much less invasive version of this, was that it was just an agency to monitor government performance. And the authors of this paper basically ruled out the first option, and they were skeptical about the second option on the basis that governments would be unlikely to delegate these kinds of powers to an independent body. And so what we've ended up in the real world through particular types of legislation, framework climate legislation, are somewhere between the second and third of these. And so we've seen around the world, in Europe, but also elsewhere, a range of climate laws that have been developed that try to lock in, do this job of locking in both long-term targets for example, 2050 or around about there for greenhouse gas emissions reduction, for intermediate targets, and also to strengthen the role of scientific advice, but not that strong delegation to technocrats, removing climate policy completely from the democratic system, but rather strengthening the voice of climate science, of experts in the policy making process, and then providing really robust mechanisms for monitoring, reporting, and accountability. So this is, if you like, a modified version of that stronger argument around emergency governance that tries to go part of the way, but doesn't go all of the way to removing climate policy from the realm of democratic politics and democratic accountability. So that's an example of an institutional arrangement that starts from the perspective that we need less democracy. That the problem, essentially, the institutional problem, is that democratic politics is getting in the way of climate action. But there's an alternative perspective that I want to finish up with, and that's an argument for more democracy. That the problem we're facing really is that the voice of the ordinary person isn't sufficiently incorporated into climate policy making. And this argument builds on a tradition in the academic literature and increasingly in practice around deliberative democracy and the use of new institutions, citizens' assemblies, citizens' juries, and other similar institutions where you bring together randomly selected people of the members of the public to deliberate on complex topics of public policy. And a lot of academic literature has shown that these kinds of arrangements are useful for dealing with, or well equipped for dealing with policy problems that are characterized by complexity, long time horizons, value conflicts, and trade-offs. And if we think about climate change ticks all of those boxes. And so what we've seen in recent years is a range of examples. These are mostly from a European context. And apologies that some of my empirical examples are mostly from the continent I know best, but there have been a range of citizens' assemblies implemented to deal with questions around climate change here in Ireland, in the UK, in Scotland, in France, Denmark, in Finland, and in Washington State in the United States. And I'm slightly running short of time, so I won't dwell on this, but in the Irish case, 99 members of the public were randomly selected and met for 2 weekends to deliberate on the topic of climate change. And the results of their deliberations were published in a report that was published in April 2018, and that set in train a whole set of policy developments. A parliamentary committee met to consider the recommendations, issued its own report, which fed in turn to an all-of-government climate action plan in 2019, and that in turn underpinned the programme for government of the current coalition government, including, importantly, and this links back to the second part of the 3 parts of my talk, a revision of Ireland's climate change law that was enacted just in July of this year, and which strengthens the role of science and enshrines long and medium term targets. So this is an example pointing in the other direction of an instance where more democracy helped to catalyze climate action. Imperfectly so, but it's an interesting example nonetheless, and one to which other countries are increasingly looking. So just to conclude with a few reflections and an apology for going slightly over time. As I said at the outset, declaring a climate emergency is the easy part. It's what follows after that is the more challenging part. And emergency politics can involve troubling restrictions on democratic norms and civil rights. There are a range of institutional fixes. I've tried to identify and discuss two of them. I guess the jury is still out. We don't know for certain whether they are capable of delivering sufficient action at sufficient scale and speed. But if there's one takeaway from my message, is that there is an enduring tension between democracy and climate action, and that plays out in these discussions around climate emergencies and emergency politics. And I think those concerns and those tensions are going to remain with us in the years ahead. So with that, I'll wrap up and hand back to Sam. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to engaging in the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dermot. I think that was a very interesting talk. I guess if I take the international perspective and the IPCC emission gaps and try and reflect that even from a smaller scale to a DCU perspective, given that we're coming out of COVID here, I can see that in modeling data that we're doing and the emission gaps that we're facing, in that some of the data is saying that, you know, during COVID, when we had nobody on campus in 2020, we can measure what emissions we had coming from our energy consumption on campus. And we are now setting targets based on our objectives to be carbon neutral by 2050, so that we're going to have a 51% absolute reduction by 2030. But looking at the model, it implies that we actually, even if we were to maintain 2020 levels of activity where we had nobody on campus, we still will not reach our 2030 targets. So maintaining nobody on campus for the next 10 years is still going to mean we won't hit our target. And so I think there's huge challenges between trying to do the right thing for climate and trying to make sure that we're going to deliver, even for what we do as educational institutions, to try and deliver education in a campus-based environment to the student body has got huge implications, both intergenerationally. So who gets to go on campus now has a carbon footprint versus, you know, will they in 2030 be able to come back on campus? And so I think there's huge challenges that we have to face, and it is how we take what we've learned through the COVID and everything else to actually look at the societal engagement to try and help that to actually come along. So whether it is more local climate citizens science or citizens assembly type style things to engage with society and engage with people so that they understand why these changes have to make, or how we're going to actually look at the bigger solutions. We're not going to take questions in the middle, so we'll take questions at the end. So I'm going to move on now. Thank you very much again, Dermot, and I will move on to Nikisha. And Dr. Nikisha Spencer is from the University of West Indies. She's a senior lecturer and economist in the Department of Economics, and is going to give us an introduction to building post-pandemic resilience, climate change, and the beach tourism. Nikisha, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you. All right, so, okay, I'm good. Okay, fine. So that's what I'll be discussing today, climate change and beach tourism. Now, I know at the beginning there was some COVID talk, but an interesting or an important question to ask is, what does the COVID pandemic teach us about how to prepare for climate change? Well, the COVID pandemic is really a wake-up call as to what can happen to economies that are heavily dependent on tourism. In 2020, the IMF reported that tourist arrivals fell globally by more than 65%. This naturally translated into loss of tourism revenue and joblessness across the industry. Now, would we see, or is it possible that we could see similar effects with climate change? We will discuss this as the presentation continues, or I will leave you to answer that question. Now, despite what COVID has done, we see that tourism is still on the move. Here we have tourists in Mexico, tourists in Jamaica, and they're wearing their masks and they're still trying to have a nice vacation. So COVID is really a demand shock, and it has basically temporarily shut down tourism because tourism is picking back up. Now, in the face of climate change, will tourism be on the move if we do not pay more than the usual attention to its effects? Well, here on the left, we have sea level rise. So that is indicative of a sinking world. And this will translate into disappearing beaches, right? So a climate is really a supply shock where sea level rise can actually permanently shut down tourism, right? So if we don't have beaches, then we have nothing to offer, right? Now, sorry, I need to navigate. Right. So despite what is happening with COVID, it's still alive and kicking. The world is still climate change focused, right? World leaders, climate scientists, researchers, and others are keeping focused on the big issue, climate change. And this has been evident, especially since September. There was a 2015 Paris Agreement where 197 countries signed or agreed to undertake certain actions to limit global warming. And just in September, there was a discussion as to what is happening with these countries. And it was stated that the Gambia is the only country in the world that is on track to cut emissions and reach the Paris Agreement goal, which is to limit global warming or to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. That is the goal for all countries, right? Other countries that are coming close, well, at least for the islands, would include Costa Rica, Ethiopia, Kenya, Nigeria, UK, Nepal, and Morocco, right? On September 17, there was a major economies forum on energy and climate. And in November, there will be a United Nations climate change conference. So the world is still climate change focused, right? Which is exactly where we need to be, even though we are still dealing with COVID. Right. So what I'll be discussing today I'm focusing on beach tourism in the Caribbean, right? Now, sandy beaches are an important feature of Caribbean islands. They provide recreational opportunities. You guys, of course, can relate to this. They protect coastal investments from storm waves, and they provide a habitat for a variety of plant and animal species, as well as they really do form part of the sea, sand, sun product that the islands feature. And this naturally, of course, produces revenue. However, the value of sandy beaches to the Caribbean economies is threatened by climate change. And this is something we need to pay more than the usual attention to because they're very valuable. Now, as it relates to climate change induced sea level rise globally, this is what researchers have put forward. An increase in sea level by 30 centimeters could destroy a significant number of sandy beaches across the world. And that could actually induce the disappearance of approximately half of them by the end of 2100. As it relates to the Caribbean, an increase in sea level is expected to exceed the world's average, right? And some countries will experience 100% beach loss, and it could be as little as 14%. That's what some have put forward. So it's extremely worrying for the Caribbean, and this is something that we need to pay attention to. So as a result of that, there are several things that we need to understand for the Caribbean. We need to understand sandy beach loss under different climate change scenarios, what can be lost in terms of accommodation near sandy beaches, and of course, what everyone is interested in, government policymakers, monetary losses. So how much will we be losing as it relates to tourism revenue? So I, along with Professor Eric Strobel from the University of Bern in Switzerland and Alric Campbell, we did a study to help to answer these questions. Now, what you're seeing on the screen, we have, this is showing a distribution of sandy shorelines. As you can see, across islands, the distribution is quite uneven. The highest proportion is located in the Bahamas. And although not shown, it's basically 46% of sandy resources. Cuba is next with roughly 21%. And then we have Haiti, Dominican Republic, Turks and Caicos with just over 5%. All the others are obviously lower, as you can see. If you look at how the bar is moving to the right, that will tell you who is occupying or having more sandy resources. And Dominica is at the very bottom, that has about 2 kilometers of sandy shoreline. So this is just telling the current status of what it looks like in the Caribbean. Now, this illustration here, we're seeing the meters of sandy beach per room. And again, it's very important to know how much to translate this into hotel rooms, because if sandy beaches go, the hotel rooms that are close to the sandy beaches will also be at risk, right? So again, we see differences across the islands. Montserrat taking the lead with 167 meters of sandy beach per room. And then we have Guadeloupe with significantly less, about 20 meters. And you have Cuba, St. Lucia. If you look at the very bottom, these are basically, these countries have about 1 meter each. So the distribution, it varies across islands, but nevertheless, this is the current status. So it's important to understand what the current status is before we begin to look at what the future holds. All right, so let's take a look at the future. Now here we are seeing the mean percentage sandy beach losses for individual islands. This illustration is, I know I spoke about, I mentioned that it's important to understand what is going to happen on the different climate change scenarios, but I'm just focusing on the RCP 8.5 for 2050 and 2100. And the RCP 8.5 is basically the high emissions pathway, or what some call the business as usual scenario. So this is if we continue to behave the same way we are doing today, we're going to have certain outcomes, right? If it is that we do not intensify our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So because this is the path that we are currently on, or we're trying to get off it, it's just more important to present this. Of course, there's another scenario, but I'm not discussing that today. No, so for this situation, the mean percentage loss for the region will be about 43%. But in terms of individual islands, the largest loss by the year 2050 will be experienced by the Bahamas. So that would be, if you look at the brown bar going more to the right, that would be the Bahamas experiencing the largest sandy beach loss. And then other islands with reasonably high losses include Cuba. So if you look at the bars moving more to the right, St. Lucia and the US Virgin Islands. So again, there's variation across islands, but this is what it's looking like for the year 2050 if we continue to behave the same way we are today. However, if we look at the end of the century, by the year 2100, St. Bartholomew will take the lead in experiencing the greatest loss, and that will be about 84%, right? So if you look, that's closer to the bottom, slightly greenish, the bar that is close to the right, that is St. Bartholomew, so that will experience the greatest loss. Still on the high end would be Bahamas, Cuba, Virgin Islands, and we have others like Jamaica that have also moved up in the race for disappearing beaches, right? So this is what the situation looks like in terms of losing sandy beaches by the year 2100. So this is extremely worrying, especially if you compare this with the year 2050. So definitely we need to be concerned about this if sandy beaches are so valuable to us, which in fact they are, right? Now, it is also interesting to look at room loss, right? Here we are seeing the percentage of sandy beach losses measured in terms of units, nearby units, right? Now the average room loss for the region will be around 15%, not shown, right? But there's going to be a large uncertainty with regards to that. I'm not discussing that in detail, of course. But looking at this illustration, looking at the individual islands, the fastest runners in the race for losses would be the British Virgin Islands. So again, you want to look for the bar that is moving further to the right. So BVI, right? And that would be about 72% loss. Trinidad and Tobago is next in line, which would be closer to the bottom, green, 66%. Then we have Antigua and Barbuda losing about 63%. And we have St. Lucia again. That is also another worrying situation, losing more than 50%, 57%. And I guess if you look at it more, you could actually add US Virgin Islands, and that they will actually lose around 46% of their hotel rooms that are close to sandy beaches. Again, this is extremely worrying, right? Now, if we look at the end of the century again, in the year 2100, this is if we continue business as usual, then we see that the countries that are most at risk, or let me ask you, can you identify the countries that will be most at risk in terms of losing their hotel beach rooms? Well, on my end, I can see Antigua and Barbuda. So if you look at the bars that are moving closer to the right, so to the extreme right, you see that Antigua and Barbuda is basically all the way up. That's 100% loss. The same thing we can say for Montserrat, right? So those islands will experience critical erosion, and that's within about 1 kilometer hotel proximity, of course. And again, if you look at it carefully, we can also say that US Virgin Islands, the British Virgin Islands should also be extremely worried, right? They will lose about 96% or 89% of hotel beach rooms, right? And we can also see that there are lots of other islands with more than half of their current accommodation no longer being near a sandy beach, right? We have Jamaica, we have Trinidad and Tobago. I'm sure you can pick Dominican Republic, and you will also be able to see that St. Lucia has a situation there that needs to be looked at carefully, right? So this is just a situation that is predicted to happen by the year 2100, and we also compared and looked at 2050 as well. So we need to pay a lot of attention to climate change, right? Sea level rise induced climate change. Now let's talk about what governments, policymakers, and even you would be interested in money. How much money will these islands will actually lose because of the situation that we could experience? Well, here I'm just presenting. So we looked at about 30 islands, but I'm just presenting the biggest losers in terms of tourism revenue. So for the Caribbean in general, the Caribbean will lose on average about 19.2% for the year 2050. So if you look at the last row in the table, and for by the year 2100, it could lose about 47%. So again, there's a bit of uncertainty, of course, with these results. So in 2050, the Caribbean could lose as low as 4% and as high as 52.5%. And for 2100, it could be 24%, as high as 26%. But because these sandy beaches are so important to the Caribbean, can we afford to lose anything? I would say no, right? No, if you look at the year 2050, the biggest loser there would be British Virgin Islands. So they would lose a lot of their tourism revenue. And so what we did, we just translated the results that I showed you before into monetary losses, which is what everybody would be interested in anyway. And then next in line will be Trinidad and Tobago. And we have Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, over 50%. And for 2100, the biggest losers would be Montserrat and Antigua and Barbuda, right? And so looking at this, we know that situation is really bad for those countries, but it's not only them. Look at US Virgin Islands. They will lose they're nearly at 100%, right? Then we have British Virgin Islands. We have Grenada losing over 80%. Trinidad and Tobago, even Jamaica and St. Lucia. These countries need to be worried about what can actually take place if it is that we don't make adjustments in terms of our actions toward climate change. No, but what can we do, right? There are things that we can do so as to not lose our sandy beaches. A common practice is to nourish our beaches. That is basically adding beach materials such as sand to recreate existing beaches. And this is basically to reverse erosion. And it's relatively low cost in terms of construction and maintenance. And of course, if you compare what these islands would actually lose, then beach nourishment is actually cheap, right? Now, there are a few beach nourishment projects that have taken place across the Caribbean. These tend to be private from my own observation, but there are many such projects in the US, right? But these seem to have been publicly funded projects. So this suggests that there is room for governments to fund beach nourishment projects across the Caribbean. And the potential benefits include tax earnings, of course, and generally, economies will be boosted. But with everything, there are issues. If there is no sand, if the cost to acquire it is expensive. And of course, hurricanes, which tend to track quite regularly throughout the Caribbean, they will also, probably pose a problem in washing away the sand. But nevertheless, this is a nice option that countries in the Caribbean can actually use, right? Other strategies that can actually be used to save our beaches, beach drainage. These have notable successes have been seen in Australia and Japan. I'm not an expert on this part, but beach drainage, but nevertheless, this is something that literature has put forward, so countries can explore this. Some have looked up at hard defenses, such as installing breakwaters, sea walls, but these have not been very successful. It doesn't mean that we can't try them. But what about building hotels further inland? That is also an option. But again, we have to consider the competition for other things. So, there are other things that we could actually use land for, like nature conservation, but, it's something to consider. And then we have non-beach tourism, which some countries in the Caribbean are actually doing. But then again, to solely rely on ecotourism would be, somewhat dangerous, because this could also be negatively impacted by climate change. All right, so in conclusion, what can we expect? What can the Caribbean expect with climate change? Climate change-induced sea level rise, where we can expect coastal erosion, loss of sandy beaches, loss of beach hotel rooms, and these will naturally translate into losing tourism revenue, which we really don't want to, because we are so heavily dependent on this revenue. So we need to obviously try to do something about it. And so what can be done? We can actually nourish our beaches, and they're relatively low costs. They're actually cheap, in my view, compared to what we could lose if we don't do anything. And although there are problems with other methods, some other measures, that I mentioned before, we could actually try to combine them, right, to see how we can best work out a solution to save our beaches and save money for the tourist industry across the Caribbean. So that's it for me. I hope that you were enlightened and enjoyed the presentation.
Thank you very much, Nikisha. That was a very interesting presentation. I guess sandy beaches are not something that we have an awful lot of in Ireland, even though we still are an island, but we do have some. We just probably don't have the weather that you could use them quite the same as what you can in the Caribbean. I guess one of the things that comes back to my mind is that this is not, and I guess it's linking it to Diarmuid's talk, in that it's not just a climate change emergency and the impacts that has on our ability to actually continue our livelihoods. It is a biodiversity emergency as well. So it is a climate change and biodiversity emergency. And so that the events of what are happening will have an effect not just on us as the inhabitants, as the human inhabitants, but on all of the inhabitants of the island. So losing the beaches is, of course, detrimental to the hotel industries, but also to the nature and wildlife that are part of that system as well. Can I now ask that the two speakers, Diarmuid and Nikisha, turn on your cameras and we will go through some questions, please. Thank you both very much for very, very interesting presentations. I have some questions in the question and answer session. So there's one in the first instance for Diarmuid. Do goals and targets actually work? Interesting question. How can we ensure that governments achieve these goals?
Well, that's an easy one to start with. Do and targets actually work? Well, by themselves, they don't. And I think we've spent far too long setting ambitious goals and targets, particularly for the medium and long term. So setting targets for 2050, or some countries are setting targets for slightly sooner, 2045, 2040. Those are so far in the distance that politicians, businesses, and all of us as individuals, we can't really think in those long time horizons. And so a lot of the focus around COP26 is on medium-term targets, so 2030, and the 2018 Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius called for roughly a halving of global greenhouse gas emissions or global carbon emissions by 2030. But even that time frame is arguably outside of the immediate decisions of, well, politicians in democratic systems who think about the next election, which is typically not more than 4 or 5 years away, or a lot of business decisions. So there are certain types of business decisions that require long-term investment. So if you're running a coal-fired power station, or if you're building a new road or metro or a railway or some really big ticket infrastructure project, you think in timeframes of decades, probably several decades. But for a lot of other decisions, 10 years is still quite a long time away. And so I think the challenge is really to turn those long-term goals and targets into really tangible short-term targets and plans and programs that we can then hold our policymakers, our decision makers to account, and business, so we can hold business to account as well. And that comes to the second part of the question, which is around how we ensure that governments achieve these goals. And so my academic discipline is political science. So I study politics, and I think about questions like this in terms of politics. And I live in a country that is an imperfect democracy. There is no perfect democracy anywhere in the world, but we have a relatively by international standards, we're lucky to have a relatively well-functioning democratic system here in Ireland. And so the strongest tool that we can use to make sure that governments stick to their promises is our own voices and our own, if we're old enough to vote, our votes. But not just every 4 or 5 years in an election. People should be, if they care deeply about climate change or indeed any other issues, they should be mobilizing, they should be engaging in the democratic process. They should be letting politicians know that this is something that people respond to, because politicians are people who respond to incentives, and the incentives they face are given by the electoral system. And so if politicians think that their re-election will be dependent on doing enough or at least doing something on climate change, then they will start to change their behavior. So that's my response. That's my answer to the question of how we can ensure that governments stick to their promises. Sam, you're on mute.
Well, somebody had to do it. Yes, I'm on mute. Nikisha, can I bring you in on that? Because I guess you're in an economics department. What kind of policies and goals are there to actually help within the Caribbean to address this beach loss problem that you're having? Or are there, or do you see anything happening in this? No, you're on mute too.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah, so I did a lot of, looking around, reading newspapers, reading policy documents and project documents as it relates to beaches. And there are things that are being done. There are some hard defenses that are being implemented, but it's just not, I would say it's just not being done enough. And beach nourishment, of course, you know, that is cheaper and that is not being done enough. The few cases that I've seen in some of the islands, they seem to be privatized, and perhaps I'm going to say that maybe the hotel owners are doing it. I know in Jamaica, for example, there was some article that was published that the government might be doing that, but it's not certain whether the government is doing that. So I see there is actually room for the government to be doing that, but definitely I didn't see anything, or up to this day, I haven't seen anything where it's been done on a wide scale. So given what can actually happen to us is something that everyone needs to pay attention to. I know maybe, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Yes, I'm saying, again, it depends on what, you know, government funding is, what the funds that the government have in place. If it's short on funds, which is, you know, kind of probably always the case, then they need to look to international development organizations to try to get them to fund some of these projects to save the beaches. But from where I stand, I don't see a lot of that happening at all. I would see more overwhelming evidence for the US and for other countries, but in the Caribbean, I'm going to say it's not being done on a wide scale.
Okay. Do you think that some of that comes from a lack of awareness of the research that you're doing, or is it simply resources are not there to enable the actions to be taken?
Well, research, of course, yes, I believe that they probably don't know, because we don't really get to showcase our research a lot. Usually it's done in an academic format. Sometimes the newspapers would ask us to to write articles so that they could publish it, but it's not done regularly, especially, you know, during this COVID time, the focus is more on that. But we don't have much of an outlet to do this for the public. And certainly, I think that is what most the tourism organizations can do across the Caribbean. They should actually use academic research, or what we actually doing, to tell hoteliers and other persons who have interest in the tourism industry as to what can actually happen. And, you know, because this is not out there, I don't think they're thinking about it seriously. Of course, there are certainly signs, but then to have predictions way into the future, I'm sure they don't have that information. They are not helped to think about it in that way. So I think we need more research exposure so that they could actually see what we are doing and they could act on that. Because I'm sure if they know that they can actually lose these things, and you know that means losing money, and nobody wants to set up a business and lose, they would actually try to take actions. Action.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, we'll move on to the next question, because there's lots of questions coming in now. So this is a question from Camille Yunus. Do you think that working from home and other drastic solutions will be required to reduce emissions? I'm not sure that I would consider working from home to be a drastic solution. I think it will be blended, but maybe I will ask Jermid, do you have a comment on this?
Well, Sam, I might ask you to, I think you're actually quite well placed to answer this question, because you think about these questions in the context of Dublin City University all the time.
So for me, I don't think working from home is a drastic solution. I think we have to have a blend of all solutions. So if I look at a full carbon footprint for our university, then the staff and student commuting to our university is about 25–26% of our total carbon emissions. So it is more than the total emissions coming from our energy consumption on campus. So both from the gas and electricity usage on all of our campuses is less than what we emit from all of the staff and student commuting to and from the campuses. So rather than being drastic, I think it is a necessary solution. We need to look at all of these solutions, both for the immediate impact of reducing our emissions, that we're trying to get to carbon neutral by 2050, and trying to understand that intergenerational impact. So in Ireland, we are creating carbon budgets that it is thought that those carbon budgets will come down to sectoral budgets. So we have a national carbon budget that will be broken down to sectoral carbon budgets, and that within public universities, so like DCU, the public university, it's part of the public sector, that institutions will gain institutional carbon budgets. So we're going to be required to stay within those carbon budgets. And so if working from home means that we can actually reduce those emissions and so that we can continue to provide some level of an on-campus experience for our students, then I think that's a good thing to do. But I do think that we need to look at the entire system of the higher education sectors and actually look for a system change rather than just tinkering at the edges and going, oh, well, yes, let's add an online lecture here and there. I think we really need to take the learnings of COVID and how we all developed really good practices of working from home while continuing to have engagement. And I know humans are social beasts and we want to actually engage directly with people. So I do think we have to have that as well. But I do think we need to look at the bigger picture of we have to get carbon to go. So understanding where your carbon emissions are coming from is a really important part of how we get to a plan to get to zero. So I would say we're going to need all of the drastic solutions. Nikisha, do you have anything to contribute towards that, or will I move on to the next question? Okay. Next question. How UNEP will collaborate with my community fishermen in Haiti to attract the COVID-19 impact in, oh my goodness, Lagonave Island from, I don't understand the question. How will the United Nations EP collaborate with my community? Maybe I can think about that one and come back to it. So I'll go on to the next question. I would like to ask, what's your attitude towards beach loss due to industrialization and mining activities? Nikisha?
Yeah, I saw the question. Well, if mining activities are driving beach loss, then obviously it's not something that, obviously something needs to be done about it, because we already have the problem of climate change. So we can't afford to have another problem driving beach loss. But I don't really know much about the mining activities, but I could make pretty much the same conclusion with climate change, that things need to be done. I do not have any practical solutions to prevent it, but the industry players, whatever they're doing, they would need to, at least compare the cost and benefits of doing so. And of course, I guess I'm going to be biased and say the cost of doing so would actually be really high, because if we consider the future of our beaches and how they contribute a lot to tourism revenue, we don't want to do anything to threaten that revenue.
Okay, Jeremy, I might bring you in for a second on that, on the idea of vested interests or special interest groups having an influence over what we should be doing versus what we have to be doing, and how they influence government and government decisions.
Yes, they do. is the short answer. And in one sense, and when teaching policymaking to students, I often try to make the distinction, which is a common distinction in the literature, between lobbying and corruption, which are two different things. And that is to say that if a business has, if a business's interests are threatened by a change in policy, whatever that is, but whether it's in terms of climate change or anything else, in my mind, that business has a legitimate right to express whatever concerns they may have to government, and for those concerns to be taken into account and given due consideration in the policymaking process. It's the role of government to weigh up the different interest groups and the different interests of different sections of society, including the public interest and the public good. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with vested interests playing a role in the policy-making process. Where I do think there is a problem is where their voice is the only voice in the room, or where there are special channels, back channels to policy makers, or that the voices of the public or civil society, for example, aren't given sufficient airtime, aren't given sufficient consideration. And coming back to one of the things that I was talking about in my presentation, these framework climate change laws, part of what they try to do is to strengthen the role of expert advice and to provide institutionalized, so specific ways in which scientific advice can be incorporated or can be considered in the policymaking process. So that is to say, not to completely overrule the vested interests, but to strengthen the voice, to essentially try and level the playing field. Because coming back to your original question, Sam, I think the role of vested interests is, notwithstanding the fact that I think they have a right to play a role in the policy-making process, I think it is an oversized role in most decision making.
Yes, I guess I would see from an Irish perspective, and it's got nothing to do with beaches, but there can be a tendency to, we all agree that there should be more cycling infrastructure because it will create better transport, but just not there, and not outside my house, and not here. And those special interest groups can actually block and hold up the implementation of what is, whether it's local authority practice or government policy to actually do this. And it's, I guess, kind of leads into the next question do you think that local government should be given a more important role in policy making regarding climate change? And that one was directed to Dermot.
Yeah, I saw that question in the chat. In the Q&A forum. So I think there are. So here in Ireland, local government is very weak by international standards. And so speaking from a very parochial context, I think there's a strong case here in Ireland for local government, the role of local government in policy making to be strengthened across the board. We have very, our existing systems of local government are very weak. And so that applies to climate change and also other policy areas. And local government has the benefit of being more connected to the concerns of local people. But on the other hand, I think that goes in the direction of the concern you were raising, Sam, about it opens the potential for well-organized community groups, for example, in the context of cycling, opposition to cycling and infrastructure, to voice that opposition and to block the development of new cycle lanes. I don't want. I mean, this is an international discussion. I don't want to get too much into the detail of particular cycle lanes in particular parts of Dublin.
But it is that that, I guess, position between the special interest groups and their absolute right and position to be able to voice their opinion on the fact that they either object to it for one reason or another. But it is that it blocks, given our current need for urgent, radical and sustained change to actually happen, not next week, but actually now, that those sort of things can actually hold up things significantly. Nikisha, from a Caribbean, and maybe it's not your field, but from a Caribbean perspective, what levels of difference are there between, we'll say, local government and national government? And how does local government play a role in addressing the climate change challenges?
Well, yeah, it's definitely not my field. I'm not into politics at all, but I think they pretty much are on the same level when it comes to addressing anything with climate change. Just maybe a few months ago, although it's still not complete, I, along with some climate scientists from physics department at UU, there's a climate studies group here. We're working on the state of climate change. So every couple of years, the government has us doing a report on the state of climate change in Jamaica, and both sets of governments, both local and national, support it. So there are no differences in terms of what, of their level of support. It's just the same. Everybody just supports it. And I believe that if we have a lot of resources, they will pretty much basically do all that they can to ensure that we are, I guess, what everybody is trying to do, be in line with the Paris Agreement, right?
Okay, thank you.
In terms of the politics, I wouldn't have anything to say about that.
Okay. Okay, next question is from Michael McKeown, and it is to both speakers. We cannot grow businesses we cannot grow our way out of climate change. So I presume we cannot grow businesses or our way out of climate change. So can the overall view that this be taken into consideration? So how do we if we can't grow our way, so if economic growth is not the model, I assume is what Michael is asking, to get ourselves out of climate change, what are the considerations that need to be taken into account to actually get us over the challenge that is ahead? I'll start with Jermid.
Well, I would be very interested to hear what Nikisha has to say on this as an economist. So my perspective on this, I think, is that economic growth. So GDP seems to be a relatively poor measure of progress and well-being for lots of reasons that are that are well documented, and yet we continue to base a lot of our economies and policy making around the pursuit of continued economic growth. So one question I have is whether we're really measuring the right thing. And the other comment I would make is the global equity dimension to this, which is that I'm speaking from a privileged position in a rich country, and I know that there are parts of the world where economic growth or development or whatever label we want to put on it is an urgent imperative of human development. And I'm not in any way discounting the importance of that, but I think particularly in rich industrialized countries that there are questions over the relentless pursuit of economic growth.
Yeah, Nikisha, as an economist, would you like to pass comment on this?
Well, I agree with Michael. We can't grow our way out of climate change. So, I mean, even from where I stand, lots of research has been done, and it has been proven that economic growth is being affected or will be affected negatively as a result of climate change, right? So I'm just going to preach adaptation. That is just the way out. It's just to try to design and implement, policies or strategies that can help us to mitigate the impact on the economies in the Caribbean and across the world.
And so I guess that leads very nicely into Brianna's question, which is which global trends will shape the world economy for the next 10 years? And maybe I'll go back to Nikisha on that first. Do you have a view of what the big global trends will be that will shape the world's economy?
Global trends that will shape the world's economy. Well, I don't know. I mean, that's not something it's a very difficult thing to address because things change so rapidly. The only thing that I could see in terms of the future would be what climate change can actually do to us. If we continue to do everything that we are doing now, then definitely we'll end up on a path that is not the best. But if it is that we follow, for example, or we are in line with the Paris Agreement goal, which is to limit global warming, then I'm just not sure what it is that, how the world will progress. But I'm assuming that it will not be as bad as I presented it to be today in terms of losing so much money.
Yeah.
Right. But it's something that definitely deserves some thought, some deep thought and discussion. I probably wish I was at that Major Economist Forum on September 17th, and I would get to hear more about what the world leaders are saying and be able to give a better answer.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there is a right answer. I guess I just think that if we're looking at a trend, do we have to hope, and I don't know whether the trend will go there, but that we're going to go more back towards values-based living rather than a consumption level or a consumption-driven standard of living, so that because we're going to have to change the standard of living, and that doesn't mean that it'll be higher or lower, but that it will be different. Whatever it is, if we don't have carbon, we will not be able to continue on the business as usual, because there is no option to continue business as usual. If we do business as usual, then we'll go to 5-6 degrees and we will make the planet uninhabitable for organized human existence. So that will be definitely a different standard of living. I mean, what we have to hope, in my opinion, is that we make the necessary changes, that we actually move to a different model of how we live, rather based on our values as, the interconnectedness between our communities, rather than based on the value of, how much stuff I actually have.
And it's I was just going to add that it's going to be something extremely difficult to do. When people are used to doing certain things a certain way, they have habits, and it's very, very hard to change, right? If you think about firms and how they produce, what they produce, it's going to be difficult for them to change, because remember, firms are interested in minimizing their costs, right? They want to maximize profits.
Yep.
So what are we going to do to get them to change, right? It means that governments would have to subsidize the way they produce their methods of production. But then again, do governments have money to do that? So it's going to be very difficult to change. And so to talk about the trends, it's something, it's not easy to answer.
Yep. Jermid?
I would agree with Nikisha that it's not easy to answer. So we are terrible at predicting the future. So history is littered with big seismic global events that nobody saw coming. The most recent being the pandemic, the global financial crisis, the fall of the Berlin Wall here in Europe, the end of the Cold War, World War I. They were all events of major global significance that no one saw coming. So I would be reluctant to try and speculate. Nonetheless, we seem to be collectively addicted to making predictions about the future. We can't help it. One thing I would say is that if we are to come anywhere close to keeping on track for the Paris goals, then the major, or at least one of the major global trends over the next 10 years will turn out to be the move away from carbon. So either we stay either on track or somewhere close to on track for meeting either of the temperature goals in the Paris Agreement, and that becomes one of the defining trends of the next decade. And if it doesn't, then it means that we have failed in those efforts. Because reduction by 50% or anything like it of carbon emissions over a decade is a defining global trend.
Yeah, and I guess that is very much what Anne White is asking, in that, the opinion on whether are the financial, energy, mobility, decarbonization of heavy industries and heavy duty transport commitments required to prevent the surface temperature increases realistic expectations for 2020 for the COP 2026. So given that that's what we actually have to do, is it realistic that we can expect them to happen? And this is predicting the future again, so maybe predicting the future. I guess it has to be at some stage that these changes are, if they don't happen, they will nearly be forced to happen because of the planetary boundaries. And as we exceed planetary boundaries and they try to readjust themselves, and it is, the politics or economics will have this ability to mitigate against the impacts of climate change if we can take these decisions sooner rather than later, and letting things get too close to the actual wire and exceeding the planetary boundaries. Okay, I will move on because we're actually.
Sam, just one thing on that to pick up on what you were saying. So I think another way to express what you were saying is, and I can't remember who said this, so I'll plagiarize it. That the transition in the time ahead will either be managed or unmanaged. So the world will not stay the way it is. Business as usual, cannot continue, and we have a choice. We can either manage that transition and do it in a relatively smooth way, or have it forced upon us.
Yeah. I guess we all have a role to play in that. And I'm just noticing the time. So we've got 3 minutes left. Do either or both of my speakers wish to make a final statement before we finish up at 2:30? And I'm really sorry to all of the other questions that have come in and haven't been answered. But the webinar will actually finish in 2 minutes. Nikisha, do you want to make a finishing up quick sentence?
Yes, and I guess it will just be in line with, I saw some comment by Dr. Jessica Byron. She was suggesting that this presentation that I did should actually be shared with members of the tourism industry, and that is something very important, because it doesn't make sense to do something as important as this and don't get it out there, so that people are more alert. Persons who are in the industry, players, they really need to know something about this. So I intend to do this, right? Because I mean, even though they would be worried about this, even persons who are not a part of the industry, people like me who just enjoy the beaches, we still need to know about it, right? So it needs to be publicized, and I intend to do that.
Okay, thank you very much. And Jermud, do you have any final comment to make?
I wish I had held back my last comment and use my closing comments, because I think what I said a minute ago about the transition being, if I could choose something as my closing remark, it would be that line that a transition of some kind is coming, and the question is whether it's managed or unmanaged. But just also to say that it's been a pleasure to participate in the discussion. So thank you very much to both of you.
Absolutely. I think that's an excellent line to finish on, in that the transition is coming. Whatever way we look at this, the transition is coming, and it is whether we can, as a communities, come together to mitigate and adapt to the impact of those, or whether we're going to let us wash over us. Hopefully, what COVID has taught us is that if we come together, we can actually address and deal with these. In March 2020, the entire planet spun on a penny, and we stopped doing things that would never have been foreseen that we could have stopped, to address the immediate threat of COVID-19. I have to hope that as we start to see the immediate threat of climate change, that we will again come together and actually look for and work together for the solutions to actually address the climate change challenge. I would like to thank everybody for participating. I would like to thank AIS for organising and inviting the collaboration with DCU and the University of West Indies. I would like to thank both of our speakers for today. Really, really interesting discussion, and thank all the participants for taking part. Thank you very much, everybody.
The Archipelagic and Island States Forum is a platform designed to facilitate 47 archipelagic and island nations to collaborate and cooperate in addressing common challenges in 4 thematic areas: climate change mitigation and adaptation, blue economy, marine plastic debris, and good maritime governance. In 2017, the idea to establish the multinational cooperation framework among the archipelagic and island states was first iterated during the UN Ocean Conference in New York. In November 2018, Indonesia hosted the first ministerial meeting with 21 archipelagic and island states. The Archipelagic and Island States Forum was established by Manando Joint Declaration. In the following year, the second ministerial meeting adopted the final outcome with 25 AIS participating countries. To achieve our vision, we focus on 4 objectives which we translate into our programs. Create an open, innovative, and engaging forum. Provide a space to share and implement innovative and tangible programs. Promote collaborative efforts among stakeholders. And create opportunity through the blue economy. Ideation, implementation, and evaluation are the core elements to our solution framework in addressing the problems. In 2020, AIS Forum launched programs to drive innovation, which are AIS Joint Research, a collaborative applied research program affiliated with academic institutions in AIS countries with various topics related to the 4 areas of collaboration. The Innovator Scholarship Program, a fully funded exchange program for talented individuals from AIS participating countries who can demonstrate exceptional leadership quality and creative mind, and AIS Innovation Challenge, to find innovative ideas and breakthroughs that can help societies and businesses to be more resilient and adaptive during crisis situations. AIS Forum also launched AIS Blue Startup Hub, a platform to connect marine-focused startup in 47 archipelagic and island states across the globe. AIS Blue Startup Hub Mentoring Program was launched with 18 participating startups from 6 countries. As an effort to realize the smart, innovative solutions, AIS Forum also engaged with public audiences through online events in a form of trainings, workshops, talk shows, and discussions with various topics and stakeholders across AIS participating countries. In light of COVID-19 pandemic, it is important for archipelagic and island states to have a resilient economy. Therefore, AIS Forum Secretariat introduces programs which focuses on blue economy. As a form of its commitment, AIS Forum developed Blue Economy Development Index, or BEDI. This index will be used as a tracking tool to determine the current use of coastal and marine resources, and it can be used as a tool to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. Blue Financing Framework, or BFF, which provides a guidance for governments, financial institutions, philanthropists, and donors to align their investments with the blue economy principles and allow them to select a project to be financed in the blue economy sectors. Smart and innovative solution programs, such as sharing knowledge sessions with experts and representatives from AIS participating countries. Plankton, which was a competition to raise awareness in reducing marine plastic debris. Impact pitching, which connects startups, small and medium-sized enterprises, potential investors, and growth enablers to gain partnership. And Ending Plastic Pollution Innovation Challenge, which was a collaboration with Marine Plastic Debris Project from UNDP Indonesia to address marine plastic pollution in Southeast Asia. Many solutions to challenges that affect AIS participating countries in 4 main thematic areas and SDG 14 goals are produced through collaboration programs. These programs will explore opportunities through innovation and experiment that benefits on a local, regional, and international scale through sharing knowledge and experiences between AIS participating countries.